The Working Class and Fascism by Kurt Gossweiler. Translation of Arbeiterklasse und Faschismus. Translation done by the reader. The question of the relationship between fascism and the working class in the face of its development has recently become very important in the course of the ideological debate with bourgeois theories of fascism, such as the pseudo-Marxist theory of Bonapartism and the interpretation of fascism as an originally petty bourgeois protest movement. In my article, this question is examined using the German example. Before the First World War, two opposing attitudes towards the working class emerged in the imperialist bourgeoisie, which corresponded to the two different methods of governing described by Lenin: the quote-unquote modern representatives of the imperialist bourgeoisie. They were to be found primarily in the new branches of the electrical and chemical industries, and their ideologists and political lobbyists had in Germany already at the turn of the century recognized that the support of the capitalist order by the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie alone was no longer sufficient, that efforts had to be made to find a mass base in the working class. They saw the possibility of such support in the transformation process already underway of revolutionary social democracy into a social liberal reform movement. In the shift of the leadership of German social democracy and the trade unions led by it to the position of quote, defense of the fatherland unquote, on August 4th, 1914, these representatives of the German monopoly bourgeoisie saw a resounding confirmation of the correctness of their cause. They were opposed by the representatives of the so-called hard cause, the policy of violence, and the refusal of all concessions to the organizations of the working class. These were mainly at home in heavy industry and of course with the Junkers. Note, the Junkers are the big landowners mainly in the east of Germany. End of note. The only organizations they wanted to allow the workers were the quote shop associations unquote in brackets from Werkvereine German end of brackets under the patronage of the employers. This attitude had economic and political causes. Economic causes were, as a rule, these were representatives of branches of industry that were not as profitable as the new industries and were exposed to fiercer competition on the world market. Political causes were, the representatives of this movement were mostly prevented by their political narrow-mindedness from properly assessing the changes in the balance of class forces that had taken place, the rapid growth of the power of the working class. They still considered the creation of a mass basis for the bourgeois order in the working class not only impossible, but also unnecessary. This only changed somewhat, but then relatively quickly, in the years of the First World War, but above all after the victory of the October Revolution in Russia and after the November Revolution in Germany, i.e. after capitalism entered the stage of its general crisis. The war made it clear to even the most narrow-minded Junkers and militarists that the rulers were incapable of advancing their imperialist aims without the support of at least a considerable part of the working class. The October Revolution alarmed the German bourgeoisie by proving that the proletariat had not only attained the numerical strength, but, at least in Russia, also the political majority to defeat the bourgeoisie. It is no coincidence that the first attempts by representatives of the quote-unquote hard cause to gain a basis for their policies among the working class also occurred in the years of the First World War. These attempts had in common with the previous policies of these circles that they were still aimed at eliminating social democracy and the trade unions. While the representatives of the quote-unquote flexible imperialist policy wanted to tie the workers to imperialism with the help of social democratic and trade union leaders, the expressed aim of the other bourgeois faction was the so-called nationalization. Note, nationalization here refers to turning the workers ideologically nationalist. This is a term that not perfectly translates into English, so take note of the special meaning, end of note, of the German workers and their quote-unquote liberation from their previous social democratic leaders, as they called it in their terminology. The hatred of the organized workers' movement remained unchanged, but increased to the point of utter destruction. The old desire to destroy the workers' movement now merged with the desire for strong support in the working class to create a new task, the challenge to fulfill the dual task of fighting the war of annihilation against the workers' movement, while at the same time winning over broad sections of the workers. However, none of the existing organizations on the political right was suitable for solving such a dual task. This circumstance gave rise to the need for a new organization that would be able to solve this dual task. In capitalism, the law of supply and demand also applies in the area of politics. The new organization arose of necessity after the demand for it had made itself felt strongly and clearly enough on the political market. However, it did not arise as a finished structure, but developed from various organizational seeds. Most of these seeds were planted by members of the Pan-German League, in German Alldeutscher Verband. This association, as it is well known, had close relations with representatives of heavy industry, in brackets Emil Kirdorf, Albert Vögler, Alfred Hugenberg, Paul Reusch, etc., end of brackets, and large landowners, in brackets Count Arnim Muskau, Udo Graf zu Stolberg-Wernigerode, Gatzlaff von Herzberg-Lottin, Baron von Manteuffel-Katzdangen, etc., end of brackets. The Fascist Party, as the final result of these efforts, was not invented, but was found in a kind of selection process for the organization that best corresponded to the new needs of the most reactionary circles of the imperialist bourgeoisie. This process was particularly lengthy, because the circles of the bourgeoisie mentioned above were only prepared to support the founding of a so-called National Workers' Party that was outwardly independent of them after it had proven that all other forms of organization did not lead to the goal. At the beginning, there was an attempt to draw the workers to the side of the so-called national thinking bourgeoisie within the framework of the extremely nationalist German Fatherland Party that was declared a so-called People's Party and founded on September 3rd, 1917. Significant circles of the monopoly bourgeoisie, the Junkers and the militarists were behind this founding. The chairman was Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. The second chairman was the confidant of the East Prussian Junkers Wolfgang Kapp, a leading pan-German and since 1912 a member of the supervisory board of the Deutsche Bank. Despite great efforts, for example, they set up a workers' department in the party leadership with the task of recruiting and conducting so-called national political education among the workers. The attempt proved to be a complete failure. The mass of workers recognized in this Fatherland Party the representation of the interests of their worst enemies. The backers of the Fatherland Party realized that it was a futile attempt to win over large masses of workers through organizations led by representatives of the bourgeoisie. For this reason, old plans were taken up to make the Yellow Unions, the economically peaceful workers' unions, the starting point for the creation of a so-called national workers' organization that was organizationally independent from the outside world. As early as the summer of 1917, the head of a workers' union in a Krupp factory in Bremen, Wilhelm Wahl, had founded a so-called Committee for a German Workers' Peace in close cooperation with the so-called Independent Committee for a German Peace, launched by the Pan-German Party in 1916, which became the starting point for the establishment of similar committees in other places in Germany. For example, Anton Drexler, founder of the DAP, German Workers' Party, from which the NSDAP, National Socialist German Workers' Party, note Hitler's party, emerged, began his political career as founder of a so-called Free Workers' Committee for a Good Peace in Munich. Wilhelm Wahl and Drexler both intended to break into the ranks of the social democratic workers through social imperialist propaganda that used anti-capitalist demagogy, albeit only against the capitalism of the Entente powers, especially against England. Drexler left the Fatherland Party for this purpose and became a member of the Free Trade Union Railway Workers Association in order to gain a larger agitation base. After the January strike of 1918, heavy industry and the military leadership made increased efforts to use the Yellow Unions in another way. as an organizational base in the working class to support the expansion of policy of German imperialism. Paul Reusch, general director of the Haniel Group, but also Hindenburg and Ludendorff, pushed for the merger of all yellow associations into a working group. They hoped that this would create an organization with at least 500,000 workers' members as a unified force, strong enough to exert pressure on the government or to serve as a support for the government. Other circles, led by Wolfgang Kapp, came to the conclusion that they had to go even further, to the founding of a so-called National Workers' Party. Kapp was one of those who wanted to make ideological conquests in the social democratic and union-organized workforce relatively early on. When, at the beginning of November 1917, Wilhelm Gellert, an employee of the Potash Syndicate, who had been active in the employee movement, in German Angestelltenbewegung, a white-collar workers' movement, for some time presented him with the plan to found a workers' and employees' party, he gave him his full support. Gellert's arguments, which Kapp obviously understood, showed how much the circles represented by Kapp had learned during the war in terms of treating the masses, especially the treatment of workers, but at the same time they also showed the limits of their ability to learn. Gellert explained to Kapp that, quote, rescue from the social democratic contamination, unquote, could only come through a national movement that the workers and employees themselves created. He thought of, quote, the German Workers' Party not only as an appendage of the Fatherland Party, but as a completely independent party, because only such would it have a chance of standing up to its social democracy, unquote. According to Gellert, the Fatherland Party is unlikely to penetrate deeply into the working class, but a pure workers' party that initially has almost the same goals can do so. With the support of Kapp and the leadership of the Fatherland Party, Gellert founded the so-called German Workers' and Employees' Party, DAAP, in February 1918. Thanks to Kapp's intercession, he was released from his duties by the Potash Syndicate in the summer of 1918 to serve as chairman of the party. The founding of this party was not just intended for the moment, but was primarily carried out with the view towards the time after the war. According to Gellert, this founding was intended to bring about a permanent, quote, turn in the workers' movement towards the fatherland side, unquote. If such a party was not created, and the workers only found the old organizations after the return from the field, they would have no choice but to rejoin them, quote, so that socialism would once again have the opportunity to celebrate triumphs, unquote. If a turn was to be brought about, then new wine should not be poured into old wineskins, i.e. into already existing organizations, but, quote, we must create something new, unquote. Only then will it be possible to, quote, steer the workers' movement in a certain direction, which we consider to be correct and useful for the workers and the Reich, unquote. This clearly expresses what the most reactionary circles of the ruling class were concerned with. Not only a counterweight to the existing workers' movement, but its elimination and replacement by a nationalist pseudo-workers' movement controlled by those circles. As clearly as Gellert was able to formulate the goal, he lacked the ability to be an agitator with mass appeal. The founding appeal of his party differed little from that of later similar foundings, including Drexler's German Workers' Party. In fact, it already contained the anti-capitalist demagogy and anti-Semitic inflammatory slogans. But these were more the work of his backers in the Fatherland Party than his own. Gellert himself was filled with ridiculous pride that he had succeeded in, quote, rising, unquote, from blue-collar worker to white-collar employee, and he was narrow-minded enough to regard and propagate this personal so-called success as a model of advancement for all workers. In an anti-union leaflet issued by his party in April 1919, when asked how the worker could improve his situation, he replied, quote, as it always was before the unions, and as the ambitious still does today, by the individual climbing from one level to the next, by changing jobs, by becoming self-employed, the position of employee must, as it were, only be a transitional period for those who strive to move up, unquote. It is not surprising that, with such a program from its chairman, the DAAP found no resonance, either among the working masses or among those petty bourgeois elements whose concern was not to advance further up the social ladder, but rather to avoid being pushed down to the lowest rungs. In August 1920 it ceased to exist. But its founding was an important milestone on the way to the formation of a party of the fascist type. It was created as a result of the insight of the Fatherland Party backers that, quote, the slogans of nationalism and economic peace had to be supplemented by new ideological elements, just as the organizational model practiced had to be supplemented by new party political formations, unquote, if they wanted to mobilize workers and employees, quote, to the left of the yellow unions, unquote. The fact that even these most reactionary circles of the ruling class in Germany now wanted this was a significant reorientation. It was a consequence of capitalism entering the stage of its general crisis and gave the immediate impetus to the enrichment of the field of bourgeois parties by party structures of the fascist type. At first, however, the November Revolution forced the representatives of all factions and wings of the monopoly bourgeoisie to follow the line of those who saw the quote-unquote shared work with the Social Democrats and the reformist trade unions as the most suitable means for saving themselves from Bolshevism and reconsolidating the bourgeois order. But no sooner had the acute danger to the capitalist order in Germany been averted than the most heated, agitating forces of the monopoly bourgeoisie and their political henchmen swung back to their old line and set about creating the political, ideological and organizational conditions for the struggle to overthrow the republic that had emerged from the revolution. One of the many organizations that owed their existence to these efforts was the German Workers' Party, founded by Anton Drexler on January 5, 1919, with the active support of his pan-German backers. The name of this foundation already indicates that Drexler and his mentors intended to use this party to continue the attempts that had already begun with the so-called Workers' Committee for a Good Peace to create a broad base, especially among the workers, for the extremely nationalist and reactionary policies of the pan-Germans and the monopolistic circles behind them. Drexler had much in common with his predecessor Gellert. Like him, he envisioned the goal of his founding the party as removing the mass of workers from the influence of social democracy and the Spartacists, the KPD, Communist Party of Germany, which developed out of the Spartacists, which had only just been founded. Like Gellert, he assumed that this goal could not be achieved with an openly bourgeois party, but with a party that declared itself to be a workers' party. Like Gellert, he was only a figure in the political game of his big bourgeois backers when he founded the party. And finally, he was also similar to Gellert in that his petty bourgeois mentality of upward mobility made it completely impossible for him to make his party attractive to workers other than those who had already a petty bourgeois mentality, like Gellert. He did not even find effective slogans for the petty bourgeois masses that were later used by the NSDAP under his successor Hitler. In the guidelines that he announced at the founding meeting of the DAP, he had indeed described his party as a socialist organization, but otherwise put ideas on paper that clearly revealed his lack of qualifications for solving the task that he had set himself. For example, it was said that the DAP wanted, quote, the ennoblement of the German worker, unquote. Every resident worker had a right to be counted as part of the middle class. A clear dividing line had to be drawn between worker and proletarian. There is no doubt that under Drexler's leadership the DAP was ultimately condemned to the same fate as Gellert's DAAP. If it was saved from this, it owed this above all to several officers of the Bavarian Reichswehr Group command stationed in Munich, in particular the head of the intelligence department, Captain Karl Mayer, and Captain Ernst Röhm, staff officer of the infantry commander of the Bavarian Division, Ritter von Epp. The German military leaders had learned not less, but even more so than the monopolists during the war, that without strong support from the working class no war could be fought, let alone won. Obtaining this support had therefore become one of their most pressing concerns. The same differences about the solution emerged within their ranks as within the monopoly bourgeoisie. while the majority initially saw no other option than to seek support from the Social Democrats and the reformist unions. This movement was represented above all by General Wilhelm Groener and his close colleague, the then First Lieutenant Kurt von Schleicher, and at times also by General Hans von Seeckt. Others, led by General Erich Ludendorff, the so-called greatest general of the World War for so-called National Germany, strove for the fastest and most thorough destruction of the Social Democrats, in brackets, and of course especially the Communist Party, end of brackets, and the creation of a so-called National Workers' Movement. That is why, after moving to Munich, he also took part in the NSDAP and with its leader Hitler. He saw it as the organization that was capable of making, quote, the internationally minded worker national again, unquote. He was convinced that this was the prerequisite for a resurgence of German imperialism and militarism. In his search for viable approaches to a, quote, national workers' party, unquote, Captain Meyer had already been interested in Drexler's party. He decided to try to make this party into an organization that would be equally suitable for militant action against the Workers' Party and the Republic, as well as for the nationalization, in brackets, ideological, end of brackets, of the working class. For this reason, he sent some of his protégés, including Adolf Hitler, who was still only a member of the army at the time, to observe and report on meetings of this party. He wanted to turn the National Workers' Party into a, quote, strong shock troop, and of quote, for the fight against the Republic, as he wrote to Wolfgang Kapp, who had fled to Sweden after the failure of his putsch in September 1920. In this letter he reported that he had been working on strengthening the DAP since July 1919, for which he had already, quote, brought together very capable young people, end of quote, including quote, Mr. Hitler, end of quote, who had, quote, become a moving force, end of quote, and, quote, a first-rate public speaker, end of quote. In a memorandum by Ritter von Epp from December 1922, the following was stated about the NSDAP, quote, the national forces awakened in bourgeois and peasant circles under the Kahr government have found strong allies in the working class circles through Hitler's National Socialist movement, end of quote. Epp had indeed fallen victim to exaggerated information with this assessment, but does show what these circles saw as the specific mission for the Nazi Party. This is further confirmed by the statements of the German nationalist MP Friedrich Hilbert in the Bavarian State Parliament. In July 1920, he expressed his expectation and hope that the NSDAP would bring the, quote, national idea, unquote, to the German working class. For as long as this idea only affected the bourgeois parties, it could not bring about recovery. This remained one of the two masks of the NSDAP throughout the Weimar Republic. This will be demonstrated by a few examples. On June 20th, 1926, the Rheinisch-Westfälische Zeitung, a mouthpiece of the Ruhr mining industry, in brackets, the Ruhr is the biggest industrial region in Germany, end of quote, wrote in its report of an appearance by Hitler before Ruhr industrialists, quote, the fact that the invitation to this lecture was accepted in such large numbers by the leading business circles best demonstrates the importance that the National Socialist movement has already achieved under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. It must be taken into account by the capitalists all the more, as it primarily concerns the worker and is fighting for his German soul. In August 1930, the DNVP, German National People's Party, a national conservative other fascistic party, end of brackets, party leadership's newsletter described the division of labor it wanted between the Nazi Party and the DNVP as follows, quote, the goal of the most accelerated political development possible in the interests of the national right can only be achieved if the German National People's Party brings together as far as possible all sections of the population that are decidedly nationalistic, but at the same time bourgeois-minded, and if National Socialism takes on and carries out the task of turning socialists with an international mindset into socialists with a national mindset, end of quote. Full of disappointment, the upper-class Berlin Börsenzeitung noted in a review of the election results of September 14, 1930, quote, The fact is that the red castle of Marxism has proven itself to be unshakable in the current wave movement of this election. The National Socialists have not succeeded in putting the idea into practice, to realize the tearing away of the German working class from internationalism and to educate the German socialist worker in nationalism." End of quote. The Nazi leaders were fully aware of the task of, quote, nationalizing the working class, unquote, in brackets, ideologically nationalizing them, turning them towards nationalism, end of brackets, and made no small effort to do it justice. Hitler himself praised himself and his party in all speeches addressed to his monopolistic patrons, financiers and clients as the only force capable of fulfilling such a task. In 1922, Hitler addressed a begging letter to business circles, the argumentation of which shows that he had an excellent understanding of what was important to the forces of the ruling class to whom he offered his services. In the letter he gave a fairly precise formulation for the double task of destroying the workers' movement and winning over the working class. He wrote, quote, "Her," in brackets the NSDAP's, end of brackets, goal is, in short, the destruction and eradication of the Marxist worldview. The means to this end are 1. An incomparable, ingeniously set up propaganda and educational organization covering all possibilities of influencing humans. 2. An organization of ruthless power and the most brutal determination, ready to counter every terror of Marxism, which won 10 times greater, the so-called Storm Division of the movement." End of quote. And further, quote, "As long as even a third of our people have this opposition to the state and to their own nationality, any resurgence is impossible. In fact, the sum of the international Marxist-minded members of our people represents over 40% of our total population. A terrible truth, especially because these 40% currently unite the most active, most energetic elements of the nation." End of quote. Here we have the basic pattern of argumentation in almost all Hitler's speeches to representatives of monopoly capital. The reference to the fact that half of the German people were internationalist Marxist in outlook, the statement that as long as this is the case, there can be no quote-unquote resurgence, and the assertion that only the NSDAP is capable of 1. Eradicating Marxism and 2. Winning back the working class for the quote-unquote nation. A few examples of this. On February 28, 1926, Hitler spoke to the major industrialists and merchants of Hamburg. He said, quote, "More than half of all adult male and female inhabitants are consciously anti-German. The question of German revival is a question of the destruction of the Marxist worldview in Germany. If this worldview is not eradicated, Germany will never rise again. We have 15 million who are consciously and deliberately anti-national, and as long as these 15 million who represent the most lively and powerful part are not brought back into the fold of the common national feeling and sentiment, all talk of revival is nonsense and meaningless. The destruction and eradication of the Marxist worldview is something fundamentally different from what the bourgeois parties have in mind as their goal. The bourgeois parties do not have destruction as their goal, but only an electoral victory." Note by the reader, Hitler apparently uses the term bourgeois to mean liberal, not a member of the bourgeoisie. End of note. When Hitler was allowed to present his thoughts to Kirchhoff personally in 1927, which he later wrote down in a brochure at Kirchhoff's request, he stated, quote, "The German people are increasingly splitting into 2 camps that are deadly hostile to one another. The prerequisite for a real revival of the German nation is the recovery of the nation's inner strength, which lies in the general, solidary awareness of the necessity of its existence and the resulting bond. The National Socialist movement recognizes the most essential prerequisite for the formation of a unified national body is the complete integration of the so-called Fourth Estate into the national community. It wishes that these millions of our people be taken away from the hands of their current international, mostly un-German seducers and leaders, and that they find their full integration into the framework of the nation and the state. It initially carried out this process in an exemplary manner within its own ranks and thus provided proof of the possibility of implementing the decision. Hitler emphatically emphasized that the NSDAP had set itself the goal of destroying the Weimar Republic. It was, he explained, quote, not a military organization to protect the current state, but a fighting organization to overcome it and create a new Reich. End of quote. In his infamous speech to the leading monopolists on January 26, 1932, Hitler again resorted to the same leitmotifs. Quote, how can a people still represent a factor to the outside world if 50% are ultimately Bolshevik-oriented and 50% are nationalist or anti-Bolshevik? It is unthinkable to create a strong and healthy Germany if 50% of its members are Bolshevik and 50% are nationally oriented. And, quote, Marxism must be eradicated. And if we are accused of intolerance, we proudly admit it. Yes, we have made the implacable decision to eradicate Marxism down to its last root in Germany. For 70 years the bourgeois parties have had time to work. Where is the organization that could compare with ours? Where is the organization that, like ours, if necessary, brings 400,000 men out into the streets, who carry blind obedience within them, who carry out every order? But not only Hitler, other Nazi leaders also expressed themselves in a similar, even more poignant way on this topic. For example, Reinhold Mucho, the later Reich Organization leader of the National Socialist Factory Cell Organization NSBO, wrote in November 1928 in the Berlin Arbeiterzeitung, Berlin workers' newspaper of the Strasser run, in brackets Strasser was another leader in the Nazi party, unquote, Kampfverlag, quote, a lot of the National Socialist Party's energy is wasted in vain on winning over people from the military associations, leagues, and even bourgeois national parties. There is a great danger that this opportunism will cause us to slide to the level of a radicalized, purely anti-Semitic and petty bourgeois party, unquote. However, as Hitler made clear, the real mission is to win over the German worker. One of the aristocratic Nazi leaders, who always played a special role, Ernst Graf zu Reventlow, even wrote in May 1930, quote, winning over a single worker for the National Socialist movement is infinitely more valuable than declarations of membership from a dozen excellencies or any high-class personalities. End of quote. All of these statements, but especially those by Hitler, make it clear that the Nazi leaders were fully aware of the role and importance of their party as a special organization of the ruling class to solve the new dual task. They also make it clear that the combination of terror and social demagogy was deliberately used by the Nazi leaders to solve this task. This brings us to answering another question. What impact did those efforts have on the development of the specific characteristics of German fascism? Contrary to the widespread view that the combination of the most radical terrorism with social demagogy arose from the fascist effort to create a mass base against the workers' movement in the petty bourgeoisie, this combination is primarily the inevitable, organically grown result of the effort to solve the double task of destroying the workers' movement, but winning over the workers organized in it. Hitler himself made this clear in his speech to Hamburg dignitaries when he said, quote, if one has understood that the question of fate is if Marxism is broken, then any means that can lead to success must be justified. That is the first thing. A movement that wants to achieve this must turn to the broad masses, to the masses with whom Marxism itself fights. The source of all power lies in the masses. This broad, stubborn mass, which fights infatuately and obstinately for Marxism, is the only weapon for the movement that wants to break Marxism. But if a movement wants to appeal to the broad masses in the knowledge that this can only be done with them alone, and if the question posed is the vital question of the nation itself, the great right comes into play that then every means that leads to the goal is justifiable. In brackets, great right here is a Nietzschean term. It refers to the hierarchy of rights in which with certain goals, certain rights are justifiable and trump other rights. End of brackets. If I can bring the broad masses back into the bosom of the German nation, who will later reproach me for the means? If we win, Marxism will be destroyed and completely. End of quote. And of course, these statements do not mean that the Nazis directed all their demagogy only at this one goal of winning over workers. From the beginning, they claimed to represent the interests of all Germans, especially of all disadvantaged classes, especially the so-called middle class. But in this respect they differed from the other bourgeois parties, including the DNVP, only slightly in the more radical tone in which they presented the middle class demands. However, no other bourgeois right-wing party, apart from fascist competitors, set itself the goal of conquering the organized working class. Although Hitler, as his statements showed, was prepared to use any means that promised success to achieve this goal, he lacked the necessary knowledge and empathy for the thinking and feeling of the socialist organized workers to be able to estimate the consequences that such a plan would entail. Although Hitler had an advantage over Gellert and Drexler in terms of training through military service and the Reichswehr courses, they had helped him to free himself of old-fashioned scruples. If he had had any before the war, they had instilled in him a firm belief in the unlimited effectiveness of force, had made him aware of the importance of tight organization and discipline for the success of a political movement, and much else besides. He was nevertheless similar to them in that he initially believed that he only needed to show the workers his own abstruse worldview in order to free them from their previous quote-unquote false beliefs. He trusted the manipulative effects of arguments that had made sense to him, that world history was not a struggle of classes but of races, that the improvement of the situation of the worker was only possible through liberation from the Treaty of Versailles and the conquest of so-called living space, Lebensraum, that the root of all social injustice lay in quote, interest slavery, unquote, and that this was a Jewish invention, like all evils in this world, the worst of which was Marxism and the Soviet state. This was precisely the line of argument that such supporters of Hitler as the Ruhr magnate Kirchhoff considered permissible. Accordingly, the NSDAP program was also very cautious in its formulation of socialist demands. Nevertheless, its authors, Anton Drexler, Gottfried Feder and Hitler, could not help but include some points in which workers should see demands that were familiar to them as so-called workers' demands. Point 7, quote, "We demand that the state undertakes to ensure, first and foremost, the citizens' ability to earn a living and to live," end of quote, could be seen as a paraphrase of the demand for the right to work. However, point 11 was intended to sound particularly so-called socialist, calling for the, quote, "abolition of income that is not earned without work and effort," unquote. That sounded very much like the principle of the Workers' Party, quote, "Those who do not work shall not eat," unquote. However, the second sentence of point 11 reads, quote, "breaking the bondage of interest," and that was a demand that the worker could not really associate with, but was more for self-employed craftsmen, shopkeepers, small business owners, farmers, etc. Point 12 was again designed to have an effect primarily on workers, quote, "We demand the complete confiscation of all war profits," unquote, as were the following points, quote, "We demand the nationalization of all previously already stock-marketed companies," in brackets, the trust, end of brackets, end of quote. Quote, "We demand profit sharing in large companies," end of quote. Quote, "We demand a generous expansion of pensions," end of quote. Point 17, quote, "We demand a land reform adapted to our national needs, creation of a law for the free expropriation of land for charitable purposes," end of quote, was also borrowed from the programs of the workers' parties and was aimed primarily at agricultural workers and land-poor farmers. It quickly became clear, however, that Hitler's arguments in these program points were not enough, that, especially in the industrial areas and the so-called red strongholds, stronger means and slogans had to be used if one wanted to gain at least a foothold among small groups of workers and break at least a few stones out of the closed wall of contempt and hostility. It was therefore no coincidence that, in the Ruhr region in particular, the Nazis' social demagogy already went far beyond what was usual in Munich in the second half of the 1920s. Gregor Strasser and Joseph Goebbels were particularly prominent in this respect. Strasser, for example, stated the following in an article entitled, quote, "Goals and Paths end of quote, in July 1927, quote, "We are socialists. We are enemies, mortal enemies of today's capitalist economic system, with its exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair remuneration, with its immoral evaluation of people based on wealth and money instead of responsibility and performance, and we are determined to destroy this system under all circumstances." End of quote. Goebbels was no less quote-unquote radical and quote-unquote socialist than Strasser. For example, in his advertising brochure, The Nazi Socialist, he wrote sentences like this, quote, "If 17 million proletarians on the left see class struggle as their last hope, it is only because they have been taught this by practice on the right for 60 years. Where can we get the moral justification to attack the proletarian class struggle idea if the bourgeois class state is not first fundamentally destroyed and replaced by a new socialist structure of the German community?" End of quote. But such quote-unquote class-fighting exercises were sufficient to raise doubts about the reliability and usefulness of the Nazis among various entrepreneurs, but not enough to impress class-conscious communists and social democratic workers. The crucial question that the Nazi leaders avoided for a long time, but which they could not avoid in the long run, was the practical position of the NSDAP in the class struggle between employers and workers, its behavior towards the unions, in wage disputes and during strikes. During the years of relative stability, the NSDAP had remained relatively abstinent in relation to these questions and had been able to limit its canvassing for workers' votes to activities in residential areas. With the onset of the global economic crisis, it became necessary to move this canvassing into the factories themselves in order to intensify the, quote, "battle for the soul of the German worker," unquote. This was also in the interests of the employers, who could respect the Nazi cell in the factory to provide a quote-unquote national counterweight to the free trade unions and the revolutionary trade union opposition, RGO, the communist trade unions, which could also be used for strike-breaking work if necessary. Under pressure from various officials from the industrial areas, a special meeting of the NSDAP's Nuremberg Party Congress in 1929 decided to move on to expanding the company cell organizations. The same resolution also declared that strike breakers would be, quote, "removed from the NSDAP with disgrace and humiliation." End of quote. This part of the resolution naturally had no practical consequences, since the entire NSDAP company cell organization was, in its very essence, nothing other than a strike-breaking organization in the service of business. The resolution was, however, effectively withdrawn by a later supplementary interpretation, which stated that strike-breaking only occurred when a strike was led by the NSBO. Until August 1932, however, the NSBO's attitude towards strikes was determined by the fact that it was not allowed to pay strike support. Its main task was declared to be the fight against, quote, "company Marxism," end of quote, in German Betriebsmarxismus, i.e. above all against the unions. This is what the, quote, "guidelines for the work of NSDAP company officials," end of quote, from autumn 1930 said, quote, "The National Socialist company official has the task of, first, defeating Marxism in its strongest bulwarks, the companies; second, developing the companies into strongholds of National Socialism. The focus of propaganda must be A. informing people about the betrayal of their political leaders, B. the nature and goals of National Socialism." End of quote. The NSBO's social policy activities were described as follows. Quote, "This includes Roman 1, advising the workforce, Arabic 1 on wage issues, Arabic 2 on labor law, Arabic 3 on social insurance, Roman 2, representation of the workforce, Arabic 1 against the company, Arabic 2 at the labor court, Arabic 3 against red officials and their terror. Roman 3, preparation and implementation of works council elections." While these guidelines, with their focus on the fight against the officials of the workers' organizations, already represented a clear aid for the employers, they were drastically tightened by guidelines from the Reich leadership of the NSDAP, which were announced in May 1932. In the introduction of these, quote, confidential guidelines for the implementation of our fight against industrial Marxism in the decisive year of 1932, end of quote, it was stated that it had been repeatedly emphasized that the NSBO is not a trade union, nor is it a forerunner of one. The NSBO is nothing more than the specific weapon for conquering the companies by defeating industrial Marxism. National Socialists only join forces in the NSBO for the purpose of bringing ideas and worldviews into the companies. The NSBO is not recognized as a union by the Reich Labor Court. Logically, therefore, the NSBO cannot represent the union in the district court. Nor can support be paid in the event of strikes. However, strike cases are rarely or almost not taken into account. Concerns about this should be dispelled by the employers. End of quote. In the explanations about the task of the Nazi work councils, these guidelines bluntly outlined the role of the NSBO as a spy and terrorist organization in the service of the capitalists with the following sentences. Quote, the most important task of the National Socialists in the workplace is the fight for our movement and the destruction of the enemy. Whatever form the enemy takes, whether it is the KPD, the RGO, or the Social Democratic Unions and the semi-Marxist Christian unions in their wake, our fight is aimed at all of these entities. Every National Socialist is further obliged to identify every Marxist functionary in the company, regardless of their slant, with their exact address. If at all possible, an attempt must be made to obtain a photograph of each of these people. If the employer is a PG, brackets, Parteigenosse, party comrade, end of brackets, he has the right to be kept constantly informed. In this way, it is possible that the individual companies will gradually be cleared of harmful elements and a large number of our PGs will find work in the company. Such address material will also be of great importance after we take power. It is also important to point out to the employers that in the event of wage reductions, which may be necessary, a National Socialist workforce would always have a different understanding of the economic situation than one incited by Marxism. The practice of the NSBO largely corresponded to these strike-breaking guidelines. Nazi propaganda, however, went to great lengths to present the founding of the NSBO and the establishment of a Reich Factory Cell Department at the Reich leadership of NSDAP as a step towards the NSDAP's increased fight for workers' interests. The intensification of the class struggle, especially in the second half of 1932, forced the Nazi leadership against its will not only to intensify its social demagogic slogans, but also to allow the NSBO to participate in strikes in certain cases and even to try to take the lead in order to finally break into the quote-unquote Marxist front. In effect, from August 1st, 1932, the NSBO leadership issued strike support regulations. The introductory general remarks stated, quote, the political struggle of the NSBO in the factories means that we have to provide our members with support, cash and food, in economic struggles, strikes, lockouts, reprimands, etc. In general, it should be noted that the NSBO is not a trade union, nor even a union-like structure, but it was and is the NSDAP's political form of struggle in the factory, in order to spread Adolf Hitler's idea of smashing factory Marxism and winning over useful German worker elements to National Socialism. The NSBO's goal is a decidedly political one. It wants to liberate the German working class from the clutches of international Jewish Marxism. It carries out this work primarily in the factories, the breeding grounds of Marxism. Just like the NSDAP as a whole, it fights for the social improvement of the German worker. It is inevitable that it must take a positive stance on the current economic struggles. End of quote. This rather tortured statement, which clearly shows how reluctantly the Nazi leaders decided to take such a quote-unquote positive stance, was followed by an attempt to justify this stance by reinterpreting the quote-unquote current economic struggles from class struggles into a racial struggle. Quote, the worker is politically unfree and socially enslaved thanks to the long-standing Marxist rule. The current economy is essentially liberal capitalist thanks to the dominance of Jewish international finance capital and the lack of a sense of community among the people. The economic struggles are taking place today between the two main groups. If no amicable, collective or other agreement is reached, the workers' sharpest weapon is the strike. We support this strike, provided it is clearly economically justified, and if the social situation of the worker is to be made even more inhumane, to the point where he can hardly live. Let's repeat it. If the social situation of the worker is to be made even more inhumane, to the point where he can hardly live, only then they support strikes. We reject outright political strikes that are merely cloaked in economic demands, with full responsibility for the inevitable disciplinary measures and dismissals of the workforce without notice. The decision as to whether a strike is politically or economically justified rests with the head of Department 6 of the Reich organizational leadership or his deputy after a preliminary examination by the GAU, in brackets the regional organization that the Nazis introduced in their party and after coming to power in all of Germany, end of brackets, by the GAU main department head 6. So the NSBO should only be allowed to take part in strikes in which the workers were fighting for their very survival. To ensure that this criterion was met, permission to strike was made conditional on the fact that the GAU head of Department 6 first carefully investigated, quote, what caused the strike, unquote. After, quote, responsible investigation, unquote, he had to send a report to Department 6 in Munich. The Nazi, quote-unquote, work leaders fear that participation in a strike could be permitted in the, quote, wrong, unquote, company, namely that of one of the NSDAP's promoters and financiers, is evident in the following instruction. Quote, the report is extremely important because, firstly, it is the basis for the final decision as to whether the strike should be carried out or not, and secondly, it can politically incriminate Department 6, among other things, if it contains inaccuracies or outright untruths. Therefore, the most precise details. Unannounced strikes would not be recognized, and consequently no support money would be paid. Great emphasis was placed on the propagandistic exploitation of strike participation. Quote, the fact that the NSBO takes the lead in economically justified strikes has a better effect on the workers than the most extensive propaganda. Therefore, the popularization of a strike under National Socialist leadership is extremely important, unquote. Above all, emphasis was placed on, quote, making the fact generally known that the NSBO pays support during strikes, the amount of which is equal to the union support and usually even exceeds it, end of quote. This also gives an opportunity to, quote, point out that behind every NSBO member there is not only the entire NSBO, but the power and solidarity of a party of millions, unquote. Fascist social demagogy towards the working class reached its absolute peak in connection with the wave of strikes that arose, mostly under the leadership of the RGO, the communist unions, against the Papen's wage-stealing emergency decree of September 1932. In October, the NSBO distributed a leaflet with the bold headline, quote, commitment to strike as a means of fighting against the policy of impoverishment, unquote. The leaflet stated, quote, any resistance by the people who have been impoverished to the core by Mr. von Papen's last emergency decree is not only morally but also economically justified. This is why the National Socialist Factory Cell Organization, in brackets the NSBO, is taking the lead of the German workers in this fight. In this defense, we will not give up the strike. This is our strike against Papen and his big finance capital. Every justified strike against the miserable cause of the system will find our support in every form. In view of the failure of the unions, we have taken the lead in the fight, unquote. In view of such big-mouthedness, the Nazis could not dare to commit open strike breaking when the Berlin transport workers went on strike under the leadership of the RGO in early November 1932. They officially declared their participation in the strike and caused a huge propaganda noise about it. Goebbels as Gauleiter, leader of the GAU, and the Berlin NSBO leaders Mucho and Engel meanwhile did everything they could to disorganize the strike front of the BVG workers, Berlin transport workers. After all, by participating in the BVG strike, the Nazi leaders had exceeded the limits of what even representatives of the monopoly circles who were well disposed towards them were prepared to allow, or at least to overlook, and the Nazis were well aware of this. But they found themselves in a difficult situation. New Reichstag elections, the parliament, were coming up on November 6th, 1932. The last elections in July had shown that the Nazis' previous voter base had been exhausted and that the party had been stagnating since the spring of 1932. No further growth was to be expected from the bourgeois camp. But the Nazi Party had to win another election victory. It had to finally prove that it was capable of winning votes not only from the bourgeois camp, but also from the camp of the workers' parties. Otherwise it would be very difficult, if not hopeless, to overcome the resistance of President Hindenburg and the circles of the financial oligarchy and Junkers behind him against transferring the chancellorship to the Nazi leader. Added to this was the growing pressure from their own supporters, who were in dire straits, whose drive for action had been whipped up to a boiling point by Nazi propaganda, and who were now tired of the many promises and could only be kept in line by actions. Thus the tactical turn of the Nazi Party in August to take part in strikes was the maneuver of a crisis-ridden party that was putting everything on one last card to avoid an election defeat. When Hitler was received by Hindenburg for a meeting on November 19th, he only had one answer to Hindenburg's question as to why the Nazis had taken part in the BVG strike. Quote, "The people are very bitter. If I had prevented my people from taking part, the strike would have taken place, but I would have lost my supporters among the workers." Unquote. The examples given should have sufficiently proven that the specific nature of the fascist fighting style, the inseparable connection between the most brutal terror and the most unscrupulous social demagogy, arose, so to speak, as natural necessity from the fascist leaders taking on the task of solving the double task mentioned several times at the beginning vis-à-vis the working class and its organizations. This was particularly evident in the actual character of the NSBO as what it was presented to the workers in Nazi propaganda. Finally, the question remains as to the result of the fascist efforts to win over the workers. In a nutshell, one could say, these efforts were unsuccessful, at least until 1933 and long after, but not without results. They were unsuccessful because they failed to achieve their main goal, namely the ideological breakthrough into the socialist workers' movement, in brackets, which here means the social democratic and communist movements, end of brackets. What's more, the fascists also failed to separate the mass of workers who followed the Catholic Center from this party and the Christian unions. The fight of the Nazis and the NSBO for the factories, the so-called breeding grounds of Marxism, ended with a blatant defeat for the fascists. In 1929, they hastily gave the go-ahead for the establishment of the NS factory cells. After 2 years, in March 1931, the NSBO had a total of 4,131 members. In order to achieve a thorough turnaround, all NSDAP members, as long as they were wage or salary earners, were obliged to join the NSBO. In September 1931, a large campaign called, quote, "Into the Companies," unquote, the so-called HIB campaign, was launched with the boastful slogan, quote, "Every company a fortress of National Socialism," unquote, and the advertising slogan, quote, "No workplace without a Nazi cell," end of quote. As a result of these measures, the number of members increased to 39,316 by the end of 1931. Parallel to the rapid increase in party membership in 1932, the number of members of the NSBO grew to 300,000 by the end of 1939. How little success they had becomes clear when one considers that a very large proportion of this number were white-collar employees, and when one compares this with some other figures. At the end of 1932, the NSDAP had over 800,000 members, and the number of Nazi voters on November 6, 1932 was 11.7 million. The free trade unions had 4.1 million members in 1931. In brackets, no factories for 1932 are available, end of brackets, and the Christian trade unions had around 700,000, in brackets, with 4.2 million workers for the center in the November elections, end of brackets. Another measurement for the failure of the NSBO's advertising efforts were the results of the Works Council elections, in German Betriebsrätewahlen, in the spring of 1931. The NSBO put forward its own lists for the first time and failed miserably. Of the total number of elected works councils, 83.6% were for the free trade unions, 3.4% for the red unity lists, and 0.5% for the Nazis. In brackets, no works council elections were held in 1932. End of brackets. Where the Nazis managed to get works councils through, they were mostly in companies where they had themselves nominated on the employee list or in banks and administrations. Finally, it is also known that workers were the only population group whose share of membership in the National Socialist Workers' Party was lower than their share of the total population. In 1932, the share of workers in the NSDAP membership was 38.8% lower than their share of the total population. 28.1% NSDAP share, 45.8% share of the population. The corresponding figures for the other population groups were: white-collar employees, 113.5% above their share of their total population, 25.6% to 12%. Self-employed, 130% above the share of the total population, 20.7% to 9%. Civil servants, 62.7% above the share of the total population, 8.3 to 5.1%. Peasants, 32% above their share of the total population, 14% to 10.6%. All of the data given show why we said that the Nazis' efforts to recruit workers were unsuccessful, but not without results. What they did not succeed in with the workers, they succeeded all the more thoroughly with the middle classes in town and country. The Fascist Party did not develop into a mass party as a, quote, national workers' party, unquote, but as a petty bourgeois party, or more precisely, as an imperialist party with a predominantly petty bourgeois following. The reasons for certain sections of the petty bourgeois joining a movement that not only waved the flag of nationalism, which these sections had always followed, but also claimed to be socialist, is a question in itself. All that needs to be said here is that the loss of confidence among broad sections of the petty bourgeoisie in capitalism as the best of all systems, the desire for a new, more socially just system that would protect the middle classes from plundering by big capital, which they expected the fascists to establish, was both a consequence and a symptom of the general crisis of capitalism. But the Fascist Party did not emerge as an original party of the radicalized petty bourgeoisie, which wanted to seize power with the help of this party in a two-front struggle against the workers' movement and big capital, as the proponents of the theory of fascism as a, quote, social movement, unquote, and the Bonapartism theorists claim. The history of the Fascist Party has provided evidence of the inseparability of the double task of mobilizing the working class against the workers' movement as a whole. But it had also shown the unforeseen possibility of achieving victory over the entire workers' movement and all democratic forces supported by a militant and terrorist mass movement of the fascist type recruited from the petty bourgeoisie in cooperation with the state apparatus of violence, and of achieving the open dictatorship sought by the most reactionary elements of finance capital by formally legal means, i.e. without a risky coup. Once this possibility had been found and tested, the, quote, double task, unquote, was no longer needed in other countries to motivate the founding of fascist parties. The motive of the war of annihilation against the workers' movement was completely sufficient. Whether and to what extent the motive of creating a mass base in the working class played a role, and still plays a role today, must be examined in each individual case. The history of fascist movements has also shown something else, that even a fascist party offers the imperialist bourgeoisie no guarantee of winning the desired mass base. This is certainly always its goal, but it would be wrong to ascribe to the fascist movement the ability to achieve this goal from the outset. It depends not least on the working class and its revolutionary vanguard, on its correct alliance policy with the aim of thwarting all efforts aimed at this. This is the written form of a lecture in abbreviated form that was given at the Scientific Conference of the USSR GDR Historians Commission in Kiev, September 19 to 21, 1978, published in Bulletin des Arbeitskreises Zweiter Weltkrieg, number 1-4, 1980, pages 32 to 71. Gossweiler Kurt, Aufsätze zum Faschismus, 2 volumes, Volume 2, Paul Rugenstein, Köln, 1988, pages 439 to 467.